Have you ever seen something so petty and ridiculous that you didn't know whether to laugh or lose your mind? That's exactly how I felt as I tightened the last bolt on a 6-foot wooden fence, one that now split the lakefront clean in half. It ran through the grass, dock, and even into the water like someone sliced it with a legal scalpel. Behind me, a dozen shocked neighbors stood frozen, watching in silence as this bold wall appeared right down the middle of what used to be our peaceful shared lakefront. On the other side of the fence stood Karen, yes, that Karen, the infamous president of our HOA, along with her cousin Margaret. Karen just stood there, jaw dropped, as her fancy lounge chairs and half-built jet ski ramp were now stuck behind a wall of lumber. How did things end up here? Let me take you back. It all began 5 years ago when I bought my dream house in Willowbrook Estates. A big selling point was the shared lake access, perfect for family weekends. My kids and I would fish, swim, and hang out by the dock until sunset. That lakefront was more than just a view. It was part of our lives. But then Karen Fitzgerald became the new HOA president 6 months ago, and everything changed. She turned into a power-hungry control freak almost overnight. She handed out fines for silly stuff like slightly overgrown grass, banned wind chimes for being too noisy, and even made it mandatory to get written permission before planting flowers that weren't on her approved list. Things really took a turn when she started playing favorites. Her brother-in-law was suddenly the official landscape inspector, and yes, he got paid, and her childhood friend magically got the pool cleaning contract, and when her cousin Margaret came to stay for a while, it was like all the rules no longer applied. That's when I noticed Margaret building her own little beach resort on the shared lakefront. She didn't just put out a chair and a cooler. No, she went all out. Tiki torches, huge speakers, fancy lounge chairs, and even started building a private jet ski ramp. The setup completely blocked the view and access for anyone else. I tried to be polite. I walked over, introduced myself, and gently reminded her that the space was shared by the community. Margaret looked at me like I had just insulted royalty. She smugly told me that Karen gave her full control over that half of the lakefront because I only used it on weekends. She even waved a piece of paper at me that she claimed was an HOA-approved easement reassignment. I had my doubts. So I looked into it. The document said the HOA had voted to give Margaret exclusive rights during her stay to better manage community resources. Funny, since I knew for a fact that 2 board members were out of town during that supposed vote. Something smelled fishy. I contacted the county office and the city planning department. Sure enough, both confirmed that the lakefront was legally tied to my property, and no HOA had the right to override that without going through a full legal process. In other words, Karen's so-called reassignment was a complete joke. At the next HOA meeting, I presented the proof. Karen lost it. Her face turned red, and she clutched the podium like she was about to launch into orbit. She claimed the HOA had secretly updated its rules to give them full control of all lakefront decisions, and that anyone who disagreed would be fined $500 a day. She even pulled out another new bylaw from some mystery meeting no one remembered. Meanwhile, Margaret's beach party continued. Loud music, piles of trash, and her jet ski ramp stood like a giant wooden middle finger to the neighborhood. But the last straw? One morning, my 8-year-old daughter tried to go for her usual swim. Margaret physically stopped her and told her the lakefront was now private property. My daughter came home crying. That was it for me. I'm a contracts lawyer, so this was my game. I spent the next week buried in documents: my home purchase contract, the property survey, the HOA charter, and meeting records. Everything backed me up. The lakefront was deeded to my property, and the HOA charter clearly said they had zero authority over deeded land. If they tried to interfere, they could be held personally liable. So I wrote up a legal notice and sent it by certified mail to both Karen and Margaret. They had 72 hours to move their stuff or face legal action. They didn't take it seriously. The next morning, Karen showed up at my door, acting like she was in some TV drama. Margaret was with her, along with a guy they introduced as their lawyer. Honestly, he looked like someone who learned law from watching Suits. They tried everything: threats, bribery, weird legal talk. Karen offered to waive my HOA fees for a year if I'd drop it. Margaret suggested we share the space. She'd take Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I just smiled and pointed to the fence posts stacked beside me. Too late, I said. The next day, I built the fence, and now the lakefront is split right down the middle. My half peaceful and quiet, and they're half stuck behind a wall they can't legally touch. Sometimes, when I sit out there and sip my coffee, I still hear Margaret's muffled speaker thumping on the other side, and I smile. As we started building the fence, Margaret's so-called lawyer mumbled something about squatters' rights. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. I politely asked him to leave. The 72-hour deadline passed, and instead of backing off, Margaret doubled down. She expanded her setup and even started building a permanent shade structure. That's when I launched Phase 2. I hired a licensed land surveyor to clearly mark the exact property lines of the lakefront. Just as I thought, the area was evenly shared, 50-50. But Margaret's beach party setup was spread way over both sides. With the survey in hand, I headed to the local hardware store and placed a huge fencing order. When I told the clerk where it was going, his eyes widened. Word got around fast. By the time I got home, the whole neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. People started asking, "Are you really building a fence down the lakefront?" I simply smiled and said, "Just marking boundaries." At sunrise the next morning, I showed up with a full crew. We had the legal permits, the survey documents, and a clear mission. By noon, a tall, solid wooden fence ran from one end of the beach to the other, right down the middle, even cutting the community dock in two. It wasn't just legal, it was poetic. Margaret came out just as the last panels went up, blocking her path to her beloved lounge chairs. Her coffee mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the deck. Moments later, Karen stormed in wearing a bathrobe and foam curlers. Behind her came a crowd of curious neighbors. What followed was pure chaos. Karen lost it, shouting about vandalism, trespassing, emotional distress, and even identity theft. She called the police. They looked at my paperwork, shrugged, and left. Then she called the city code enforcement. They found nothing wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if she tried reaching out to the governor or the Pentagon. Meanwhile, Margaret's luxury setup became a joke. Half her jet ski ramp was now useless. Her sound system? Split in two. The shade pavilion? Crooked and non-functional. Its posts standing awkwardly on both sides of the fence like props in a bad theater play. That evening, Karen held an emergency HOA meeting. She had passed out flyers earlier, painting me as the neighborhood troublemaker. But it backfired. Big time. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd crossed. First to speak was Tom Harrison, a retired judge who calmly listed all the legal violations Karen and the board had made. Then came Sarah Chen, who shared how Karen's crew had bulldozed her flower garden without permission. One by one, neighbors stood up, sharing their own horror stories, everything from favoritism to shady contracts. And then Margaret's husband showed up. He took one long look at the fence, the legal mess, and his furious wife. That was it. He told Margaret they were done and began packing up her whole setup. As he loaded things into a truck, people overheard him muttering that Karen had dragged them into a money pit. Karen wasn't finished, though. In a final desperate move, she tried to issue an executive order to have the fence torn down. But this time, the HOA board's attorney finally spoke up. He stated clearly that Karen had gone too far, had put the HOA at serious legal risk, and needed to be removed. The vote to kick her out was immediate and unanimous. Karen was officially out, but that still wasn't the end. The HOA board decided to take legal action. Turns out Karen had used HOA funds to fake the easement documents for Margaret. Worse, she'd also been secretly redirecting money from the landscaping budget to give her brother-in-law extra payments. 3 months later, Karen stood before a judge, facing charges for fraud, embezzlement, and abusing her role. The verdict? Guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered to repay $47,000 to the HOA. As the judge dropped the gavel, Karen broke down in tears. And me? These days I still sit out by the lake with my coffee in hand, looking at that perfectly straight fence and enjoying the peaceful view. The water's calm again, the neighborhood is calm again. And if watching Karen's HOA empire fall apart gave you a little satisfaction, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more wild neighborhood stories. Trust me, the next one might be even crazier.